Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life, times, and works of Sigmund Freud. My guest for this is Dr. Frank Talis. Frank Talis is a writer and clinical psychologist. He's the author of many books, including the one he joins us to talk about. It's called Mortal Secrets, Freud, Vienna, and the Birth of the Modern Mind. Frank Talis, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you for having me.
Sigmund Freud was born on May 6, 1856 in Moravia, but early on, his family would move to Vienna in Austria, at the time part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire. Vienna plays a very important role in the story that you tell about Sigmund Freud. Tell me about Vienna in Freud's time.
Well, Vienna was just about the most exciting place in the world. I mean, it was somewhere that was alive with advances in virtually every area of human endeavor. So if we look at the sciences, if we look at the arts, there was just this extraordinary explosion of creativity. And that inevitably influenced Freud's thinking, because that was Freud's environment, the environment that he grew up in. And it was just an incredibly fertile time. And it even stretches in terms of its influence to the present day, which is really why the book is as much about the development and the making of the modern mind as it is about Freud's time, because we can still feel the impact of that creative explosion today.
You even have an entire chapter titled in about the coffee houses in Vienna.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that may be part of the secret of Vienna's success as a creative powerhouse. I mean, of course, there were coffee houses in many European capitals. You know, you find a coffee house culture in Paris, you find a coffee house culture in Berlin. But there was something special about the Viennese coffee house that seems to have had a particularly important role in catalyzing intellectual life in Freud's Vienna. And many cultural commentators have tried to work out what that might be. I guess one of the factors would have been that there was a very significant housing shortage. And that meant that many impoverished and down-at-heel intellectuals needed somewhere to go, particularly in the winter months, to keep warm. And the thing about a Viennese coffee house at the time was all that you needed to do was buy one cup of coffee, and then you could stay there all day. And so there was a thriving intellectual life in the cafes of Vienna. It's also the fact that Jewish culture was very important, and that isn't a glib sort of racial stereotype. There was something very, very important about Jewish culture at the time. Obviously, many Jews had come to Vienna fleeing persecution, and knowledge in Jewish culture was valued enormously, because once you have knowledge, it's something that can't be taken away from you. So it's very difficult to think of a significant coffee house in Vienna at the time that was very important culturally, that wasn't also patronized by quite a significant Jewish clientele. And it was also something that, as a cultural institution, it was something that was valued enormously by writers. It created its own literature. I mean, unlike the Parisian coffee house or the Berlin coffee house or the London coffee house, there was a literature that grew around the Viennese coffee house. And people started to think of it almost like as a state of mind, a particularly fertile state of mind in which the exchange of ideas was emblematic of what happened there.
Whenever I talk about Vienna, I always think of Stefan Zweig, the writer who wrote about this period of time, also wrote about the rise of fascism in Vienna, the rise of Nazism, and how he saw this sort of vibrant intellectual community torn apart because of Nazism and the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism. Freud had a relationship with Stefan Zweig.
Yeah, certainly, and they corresponded, and I mean it's very interesting, Zweig's observations of the genesis and the impact of the rise of fascist ideology. Although the origins, the very very early origins of particularly sort of Hitler's brand of fascism can be found in late 19th century Vienna. There was an extraordinary culture of secret societies. They were almost like cults, and pan-German nationalists, who also wrote a great deal, were instrumental in developing the ideas that eventually Hitler adopted. Of course, he was at one time a down-and-out artist in Vienna, and he was massively influenced by the ideas of these cultish proto-Nazis. You had people like Guido von List and Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, and these guys really worked out the basis of the very, very basics of Nazi iconography. So they introduced the swastika as a symbol of pan-German nationalism. You have ideas of the master race being introduced, the idea of blonde, healthy, blue-eyed, sort of fit brood mothers, providing generations of the master race. All of these ideas are being developed by these guys in very sort of cultish circumstances, and a young down and out Adolf Hitler was exposed to these ideas, and in a way he served a kind of dictator's apprenticeship. There was also at the time the influence of Karl Weger, who was an interesting figure because he was kind of like a modern populist politician. He created his own frame of references. So he was quite sort of anti-Semitic, but at the same time he actually had a circle of Jews that he accepted, particularly because they were of personal advantage to him. So he had a kind of flexible ideology that was really geared to his own sort of personal advantage. And many of the sort of signature features of populism one can actually trace back to Karl Weger and the kind of politics that was there at the time. And as I say, quite a big influence on the young Adolf Hitler.
But before the rise of the Nazis, then, is there just this coexistence in Vienna between sort of liberalism and fascism?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that those two apparently contradictory intellectual traditions are there. Now, the early proto-Nazis, the early sort of fascists, were regarded by the more sophisticated intellectuals as what they were regarded as being, a bit of a joke. It was seen as extraordinary posturing, and it was seen as an ideology that would never catch on. And of course, how wrong they were. And that's why the time is absolutely fascinating to study, because it has lessons for the present. I mean, there are many things that, are said today politically that might be seen as a threat to civilization as we know it, but it seems implausible that a particularly pernicious ideology might catch on and might have a massive influence on society, and lots of sort of sophisticated intellectual Jews in Freud's Vienna just didn't take the rise of fascism seriously. I mean, they thought that it would never happen. Nazi ideology would never catch on. They were too sophisticated as a culture, too liberal, too tolerant as a culture for this to take hold. And yet, of course, it did, with devastating consequences for the entire world. And it is interesting how sometimes two opposing ideologies or views can coexist for a period, and certainly there was both tolerance and liberal thinking, and the rise of fascism from its early beginnings with the proto-Nazis at the end of the 19th century.
Sigmund Freud identified himself as Jewish, saw himself as Jewish, and he was also atheist.
He was very much an atheist, strongly atheist in terms of his personal views. He felt that religion was a kind of regressive, infantile state of mind, largely because of his realism. He was very good at looking at life, seeing the complexities and the difficulties and the hardships of life, and the obvious presence of, I guess, what we might call evil in the world, and saying this is just how it is, and we can't really expect there to be some kind of master plan or some sort of father figure overlooking this and making it okay. So his atheism was strongly linked with his realism. And in terms of his Judaism, he always said that he was forced into defining himself as a Jew because of anti-Semitism. He felt that he was forced into that identification, and that, left to his own devices, he preferred to see himself as the product of Germanic culture. He had a great love of the German language. He had a great love of German culture, in the broadest possible sense, I mean, obviously including Austria and the German-speaking peoples. So his Judaism and his Jewish identification, his Jewish attachments, were those that were forced because of circumstance and environment. And it may be that actually, I mean, in a bizarre way, anti-Semitism provided the conditions for the development and flourishing of psychoanalysis, particularly in the early days. I mean, obviously, the Nazis despised psychoanalysis, and Freud's books were burned, and he, eventually had to escape Nazi persecution. But the very fact that Freud's Vienna, was anti-Semitic, and there were obstacles to his progress, meant that his development as a doctor, as a psychologist, as a theoretician, was very, very focused. So he had to establish it. Establish his ideas, usually among a peer group who were also Jewish, who were sympathetic to what he was trying to do, the way he was looking at the world, and almost as a response to persecution and hostility. this necessitated developing psychoanalysis as first a tightly knit group of fellow like-minded thinkers and colleagues, and then also recognizing that for these ideas to catch on, it would require an organization, it would require a certain amount of thinking of this as a movement. And so, in a bizarre way, the anti-Semitism that he was presented with acted as a spur to the psychoanalytic movement, and created conditions that that perhaps in the early days assisted in terms of the development of psychoanalysis.
That's interesting, and I'm ahead of the timeline I wanted to be at this point, because I was going to go chronologically, but I think we're going to jump around now because I want to follow up on that. How did elements of fascism influence you think? Do you think? I mean, did he study it? Did it influence his actual theories when it came to psychology?
Not really, in the sense that Freud wasn't political. He was a tolerant liberal in terms of his thinking, and he found all politics a little bit disappointing. He found that both left and right ultimately disappointing. And I guess he perhaps saw through some of the less attractive aspects of political life. So he certainly wasn't a student of politics, and sometimes he could be very politically naive. So yeah, in terms of how it have influenced his thinking, again, a lot of Nazism, fascism, when it first started, he didn't really respond to it as he should have. And in some ways, he was very slow to react. I mean, his colleagues, his disciples, had to persuade him to leave Nazi-occupied Vienna. He wanted to stay. It was his home. It was where he'd lived all of his life. It was where his friends were. When he thought of himself as Germanic, I mean, this was his culture, this was his home, and he was an old man, and he was very resistant to the idea of leaving, which was odd for someone who was very insightful. It's surprising to hear that with all of this going on around him, and he was a profoundly insightful man, he couldn't apply it to his own circumstance initially, and did want to stay. And it was only under duress and with a great deal of persuasion that he finally left Vienna for London to, in his words, to die in freedom.
And his death is interesting too, but I'm going to save that for the end as I jump around here again. Let's get to the early professional life of Sigmund Freud. What's important to know about his early years that would end up leading to somebody we'd all recognize as this really influential character of the late 19th, early 20th century?
His early years were characterized by a fascination with neurology and the brain. And so he was very much influenced influenced by the neurology of the time. He went to study with Charcot, a great French neurologist who was experimenting with hypnotism. And I suppose Charcot's idea was that certain forms of disorder, psychological disorder, could be produced by ideas, traumas that are buried in the unconscious mind. So that's something that eventually was developed and became central to psychoanalysis. There was an understanding of the way the brain is structured. And so the brain has primitive animal parts and more sophisticated human parts. And the human parts are very important for inhibition, sort of inhibiting violent urges, sexual urges. And so you can see correspondences between the neurology of the time, very early neurology, and what became psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis recognizes very sophisticated aspects of the mind and more primitive aspects of the human mind. And repression is a very significant feature of Freud's psychology. The more primitive aspect of the human animal, certainly in terms of our social environments, are kept in check by the more sophisticated aspects. And this corresponds actually with neurology. I mean, there are structures in the brain, in the subcortex at the center of the brain, that that mediate our more primitive feelings, our more primitive emotions, desires, and we have a cortex, particularly a frontal cortex, which has a very important inhibitory role. So Freud's training as a neurologist, his studies with Charcot, all influenced him in a way which led to the development of something that we would recognize today as psychoanalysis.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Dr. Frank Talis, who is a writer and a clinical psychologist himself. He's the author of the book that we're in conversation about. It's called Mortal Secrets, Freud, Vienna, and the Birth of the Modern Mind. Thinking of the clinical work that Freud did, much of which, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but much of which would help lead to many of its ideas. Was his clinical work mostly with women?
Well, I think most of his sort of early work was with women. That was largely because at the time he was, practicing as a neurologist, and hysteria was one of the main problems that he saw, and hysteria was something associated more with women than men.
The word hysteria itself means, its etymology means uterus in Greek.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it goes back to some very, very early medical ideas from the classical world that women become psychologically distressed and unstable if they have a sort of wandering womb, a kind of a completely crazy idea. But Freud actually rejected entirely the idea that hysteria was something that was purely associated with women. And he was really quite modern in that sense. And he always, throughout his life, was very. Sometimes there are some commentators who consider him to be sort of misogynistic, and some of his writing to be unfair on women. But actually, he was a great one for sexual equality, particularly in the clinical sphere. He said that it was very important to treat men and women identically. There were lots of contemporary clinicians who denied female sexuality. Very, very eminent clinicians at the time, suggesting that women had no sexual feelings and that they were sexually anesthetic, as they termed the condition, and that was part of just being a normal woman. And moreover, they actually said that if women weren't sexually anesthetic, then the world would be like a brothel, and it would be the end of family life. That civilization couldn't function. Whereas Freud was very keen to stress that women, like men, have sexual feelings, and that was very much part of his clinical outlook. He said that they should be treated the same clinically. We should use the same language. And although many feminists have criticized Freud, there are equally other feminists who have said that he's made a very great contribution to equalizing the sexes. And he's criticized, I mean, sometimes psychoanalysis is criticized for being patriarchal. I mean, some of these feminist writers have actually said, well, we should always remember that he wasn't recommending patriarchy. He was actually describing the patriarchy of the time. And if you really want to really get to grips with inequalities, then you also have to maybe look at what some of the things he had to say about how patriarchies work. So yeah, I mean, he was somebody who has been criticized, but he's also been championed by feminists. And certainly there were many feminists, or we would call feminists at the time, who valued his writings about female sexuality, because they were not only looking for equality in the workplace, they were also looking for equality in the bedroom. So yeah, he was championed by many feminists in his day.
What were, do you think, some of the negative things that he did promote? Let me ask this specifically, because this seems to get lots of people upset, and it seems ridiculous. But the whole issue around penis envy, that women experience penis envy.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I wouldn't defend. He said really ridiculous things. And there are really ridiculous aspects of psychoanalytic theory. I mean, he said things like, that women take a special pride in their genitals. I mean, he just pulls these phrases and sentences and observations out the air that they're really sort of unsubstantiated and are just opinions. And there are many, many aspects of Freudian theory that people do get sort of upset about, and quite rightly so. And I wouldn't defend them. But what I would say is that Freud bashing tradition has probably got out of hand, and it's got so out of hand that his valuable intellectual contributions are now dismissed, and it's quite hard going to get people to even consider them. And if I may, I'll just list a few. I mean, so first of all, he introduced a compassionate form of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, at a time when many of the treatments were brutal. Many of them were physical treatments that were quite barbaric. I mean, his patient, Dora, before she went to see him for psychoanalysis, I mean, one of her treatments was having an electrified wire brush thrust down her throat to treat a nervous cough. So at least he's introducing a form of therapy that's compassionate, takes into account how someone feels, takes into account their life story. A discursive relationship is established. Interpretations are made. Experiences are acknowledged, legitimized in therapy. So the therapy is a valuable contribution. His psychoanalysis is the first recognizably modern psychotherapy. I mean, Freud wasn't the only psychotherapist at the time. There were other people, but his has a lot to recommend it, and it certainly influenced the development of psychotherapy thereafter quite considerably. He was instrumental in establishing the idea of the unconscious within the scientific discourse. The idea of the unconscious existed before, but he kind of brings it into the center of scientific life, and that was very forward-looking. So no modern.
How does he do that?
Well, he just put it at the center of his theories. He gave the unconscious a role in terms of his clinical work. The idea that repressed unconscious memories might actually produce symptoms. And he also, in terms of understanding the human mind, thought that a mind can't operate without having a stratum that is unconscious. And of course, there was a time not so long ago when people rejected the idea of the unconscious. I mean, I'm old enough to remember being in psychology departments where there were psychologists who didn't believe that minds had an unconscious, and yet no, as I say, no modern neuroscientist would accept that the human mind doesn't have an unconscious. There will be an embrace of the idea. Now, they haven't embraced the fully fledged Freudian unconscious of dreamscapes and symbols and endopsychic myths, but nevertheless, there is an idea that human beings have an unconscious mental life, and that is central to being human. Basic drives. He emphasized basic drives, and he thought that basic drives, like the sex drive, influenced how the mind developed. This is very, very similar to modern evolutionary psychology. So he has he was quite forward-looking in that respect. His model of the mind, his idea that you can look at the mind and think about the mind as having the id, the ego, the superego, a kind of conscious mind, primitive unconscious, and a sort of conscience. It's a simple way of thinking about the human mind, but many very, very distinguished contemporary scientists have thought, if you're going to think about the mind, that's a good way to think about it. So people like the Nobel laureate Eric Kandel said that Freud's way of thinking about the mind is probably the best that we have, certainly the most coherent, most successful. The great AI pioneer Marvin Minsky said that he thought that Freud's ideas about how minds were structured were extremely valuable. His analysis of why there's so much unhappiness in the world is very powerful. I mean, civilization and its discontent. It was his work in which he tried to explain why so many people in Western civilized nations were unhappy, and he really comes to a sort of evolutionary formulation that evolution works very, very slowly, whereas culture moves faster, and we live in modern environments that our Stone Age brains aren't adapted to, and so there's conflict between the modern world and our Stone Age brains, and it makes us unhappy. And it's a very kind of simple but quite powerful analysis. So he doesn't look at tiny details. He goes right for what is the basic reason why there is so much unhappiness in sort of modern, civilized Western life. He liberalized attitudes to sex. He more or less ditched the idea of normal, abnormal, saying that, we're all quite complicated sexually. And if we're honest about it, perhaps this idea of being normal and abnormal isn't such a good way and a very compassionate way to look at how people are. And he places childhood at the center of his psychology. Many psychologists and psychiatrists and neurologists were very negligent of the importance of childhood. And again, it's part of that sort of compassion. He was able to look at children and try to enter their world, to try to see a world or the world through a child's eyes. And I suppose finally, he was an extraordinary modern prophet. He had this idea of the death instinct, which has never been a popular idea within psychology and even psychoanalysis. His disciples at the time didn't even buy it. But he said that there is this thing, this sort of destructiveness that is like a death instinct in human beings. And although it's a difficult concept to justify scientifically, if we don't have a death instinct, we certainly behave as if we do. Because if you look at, sometimes it's called the polycrisis, this idea that where there are all kinds of extinction scenarios we're now facing. Most of those are created by us. I suppose the biggest one is climate change. Um, and we are extraordinarily relaxed sometimes when presented with extinction scenarios. It's a little like when Putin walked into Ukraine. People were starting to talk about the possibility of the Third World War. Um, you know, Life went on. There was a kind of acceptance that these things happen without what one would expect would be a rejection of that and a general kind of uprising that no, we really can't go in that direction because that's the end for all of us. So he's a very good modern prophet in that way. So I've just listed a lot of things that are impressive about Freud's thinking, and those are the kinds of things that Freud bashers just simply don't accept or reject. And I think it's unhelpful if we're trying to take a balanced view of his intellectual achievement and the fact that perhaps maybe we still need him, and some of his ideas are still helpful if we listen to them and try to respond to them as a culture.
Civilization and its discontents is interesting to me. I think just intuitively, I feel as though this rapid pace of modernization does create a sense of alienation.
Sure, absolutely. And it's also the fact that all of the old social systems are breaking down. Ideas of community. I mean, the internet has created so many divisions, and social media has created so many divisions, and it has affected the way we see ourselves. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, actually, the internet, I think, is a very good example, and social media, of how a Freudian idea has modern mileage, because Freud wrote about crowds, and he was very interested in the behavior of crowds. That, if you get a lot of people together, they stop behaving like a crowd and they behave like a mob. And it's as though the primitive unconscious is released. There is a sort of a numbing, kind of anesthesia of higher intelligence, and somehow the more primitive, the cruder aspects of human nature spill out from the id. It's as though when you're in a crowd, you take the lid off the id, and the primitive is expressed. And there's no bigger crowd than social media. And if you look at what happens on social media, it's exactly like what Freud predicted. You get like massive crowd behavior, insults, aggression, primitive thinking, the taking up of positions, a lack of nuance, a lack of discussion, a failure to. I mean, Freud said that in the unconscious, the unconscious doesn't respect truth. So in a way, the id's sort of like favorite sort of reading matter is fake news, and of course you kind of get that on on social media, just people just making stuff up. We seem to have lost that framework, that those orientation points of truth and falsity. And so some of these Freudian ideas about crowd behavior, and the release of the unconscious and the primitive, are very eloquent descriptions of what we see on a day-to-day basis, every time we go online. And that's a kind of interesting fact about Freud, is that he appears to be a kind of Victorian figure. And he was steeped in classicism, classical literature, German Romanticism. He appears to look backwards a lot of the time, but oddly, he's always looking forwards. There's a curious aspect of his thinking that he appears to be looking one way when in fact he's doing the very opposite. He was someone inspired by classical literature. He was inspired, so you get the idea of classical literature influences ideas like the narcissism, from the legend of Narcissus and
Oedipus.
Narcissus, yeah, Oedipus, of course, and all of these ideas, which seem to be dated and inspired by thousands of years of age-old culture, and yet many of his ideas are applicable to the modern world. I mean, it's like if you get a book on modern day robotics and artificial intelligence, most of them will reference Freud's essay on the uncanny, because he said some very, very interesting things about dolls and mannequins and their role in, I guess, what we might call Gothic literature or literature that unnerves us. Why is it that dolls and mannequins and these kind of things appear in horror stories? And what he said was that when something approximates the human form but isn't quite there, we're not sure whether it's dead or alive, and it's particularly disturbing to us, which is why you get these things in horror literature and Gothic literature. And roboticists and AI theorists have found that idea interesting and useful. And you often find Freud's ideas about the uncanny and what we find disturbing being related to androids and robot design in books on AI. And it's a perfect example of this looking backwards and somehow being relevant to the future, because he writes about the uncanny in the context of German romantic literature, and he's kind of looking back a little way, and yet somehow what he does with that intellectually is he manages to formulate ideas which a modern roboticist or AI theorist might find interesting.
In 1923, Sigmund Freud is diagnosed with mouth cancer, and he sees, and it will be, sees this as terminal, that at the end of his life is near, is on the horizon here. And yet, and I found this really interesting reading this part of your book, it's after this diagnosis, after this acceptance of his mortality, he would still live more than another decade, but still, I don't think he necessarily feels it at the time. It's after this diagnosis that he comes up with some of his more notable works, even including about the id, ego, and superego. And id, ego, superego are all terms we all popularly know and have a caricature in our minds of, sort of have fun with now, not even take seriously. But these are actually serious ideas that are even evident in the actual meaning of those words themselves, or the meaning behind the words.
Oh, sure. And not only that, I mean, the point you raise is very interesting. This idea that we can almost have fun with them and joke about them, and yet this idea he has about the structure of the mind has proved very, very fertile. And actually, there are advances. I mean, cutting edge advances in neuroscience that are consistent with these ideas. I mean, the world's most cited neuroscientist is Carl Friston, and he has written some extraordinary theoretical papers on really how minds are structured and how they develop. And it's, as I say, I can't stress this enough. It's really kind of cutting edge, sophisticated neuroscience. And not so long ago, he wrote a collaborative paper with another neuroscientist in which he looks at how some of his ideas are correspondent with Freudian formulations. So that, in a sense, some of his ideas about how the mind develops are entirely consistent with how Freud saw the mind developing into these particular kind of agencies. that combine to make up the mind. So yeah, and as you say, it's amazing that that as he was really facing death, he actually sort of accelerated. He became more intellectually fertile, and as he was getting older and more tired, and life was getting more difficult because he was in a great deal of pain, had to go for go through many surgical procedures. He wouldn't take painkillers because he didn't want to have a clouding of his thoughts. He wanted to think clearly. He could tolerate pain because he wanted to think and wanted to remain intellectually active because that was his great reward. And even when he was really very, very ill, right at the end of his life, when he was in extraordinary pain, he was still showing enormous interest in what was going on in the world of psychoanalysis. He was reading Balzac in French, and he was, yeah, just completely intellectually engaged. And it was really only in the very, very last days of his life when his body was pretty much decaying. Sadly, his cancer was actually producing a stench that meant that his dogs wouldn't actually go near him because the smell was so bad. They had to put a fly net over him because he was attracting flies, and he was incredibly frail, and he was in enormous pain, and yet, and I suppose this really underscores his credentials as someone who was a realist and someone whose philosophy allowed him to accept reality, however challenging. He maintained an intellectual life until the very end, and he was very accepting of what was happening to him until the very end. Although he did have an arrangement with his physician that when it all stopped making sense, that he would take a lethal dose of morphine, which he did. And so ultimately, he accepted his own death and was in control of that.
He was euthanized.
Yeah, and he just saw that as something that was logical. There was no point in continuing. He was coming in and out of consciousness. His life was a life of intellectual vigor and vitality. He saw no point in going on and could accept that. And he did so as an atheist. He didn't find God or look for God at the end of his life. It was the end. He had reached the end, and he always he spoke about old age and illness in this extraordinarily accepting and realistic way, that yes, of course, this is what happens. We grow old, we get ill, and we die. And so he's a tremendous sort of like advert for the utility and potency of his worldview. It armed him with a kind of mettle, a kind of strength of character that even allowed him to keep a quality of life under extreme duress, in pain, and it allowed him eventually to face death with enormous courage, with a kind of, it's the kind of acceptance that you associate with spiritual ideas like Buddhism, a kind of an acceptance that this is just the way things are, and why rage against it? Why not just go peacefully with the inevitability of life processes which ultimately end in death?
He euthanizes him, dies in 1939 in exile in Great Britain, But he's even thinking about euthanasia long before 1939. Really, right at the beginning with this diagnosis. I mean, he lives a long time with this mouth cancer. If he's diagnosed in 1923, we're talking about 15, 16 years. But he's considering euthanasia early on in the process of developing mouth cancer.
Yes, and it was something, I suppose, that we can associate with the Viennese mindset. I mean, it's very interesting that in Freud's Vienna, the Viennese seem to have a very casual attitude to dying. I mean, Freud grew up in a culture that was, how can I put this, laissez-faire about dying. I mean, in dueling, for example, there was a massive dueling culture. Lots of young men engaged in duels and died. Dueling culture lasted a lot longer in Vienna than other European capitals, maybe with the exception of Berlin. But it certainly lasted a very, very long time. And, if you look at also the suicide rate in Vienna at the time, that is very curious. And the reasons that some Viennese intellectuals, gave for wanting to die and end it all. I mean, my favorite. I mean, obviously, suicide is a very serious business, but it almost became comic. I mean, my two favorite examples were two Viennese figures who committed suicide, and one of them did it because he'd been bitten by a dog, and the other did it because he didn't like the direction of modern literature. This kind of bizarre, kind of casual attitude to just ending one's own life. And they had a very intimate relationship with death as well. I mean, the Viennese loved big funerals. I mean, funerals were like sporting events in Freud's Vienna. They were big spectacles, horses, carriages, flags, pendants. I mean, there was a theatrical aspect to it. And I suppose in a way that's because, the golden age of Vienna ended in with the First World War. And there was a sense that the Habsburg Empire was a senescent empire, that everything was coming to an end. It would all fall apart. And it seemed to get into their mindset that just endings, death, it was a part of life. And it was inevitable not only for the individual but for the culture. So perhaps, it isn't so surprising that Freud had this attitude to the prospect of euthanasia, dying, because he grew up in a culture that was to a certain extent very accepting of death and dying, and there were emblems of this thinking all around him in terms of Viennese culture, particularly when he was a young man and up to the First World War.
Frank Talis has been our guest. Again, Frank Talis is a writer and a clinical psychologist. He has joined us for a conversation about his book called Mortal Secrets, Freud, Vienna, and the Birth of the Modern Mind. Frank Talis, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you immensely.